Well, hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today is a very different kind of video because I will not be flying in this particular video. And as you can see, I've got my dad with me right over here. Say hi everybody.
Hey everybody, nice to see everyone.
So a lot of you have actually asked me in the comment section below how I got into aviation and what my dad's involvement is, how he got in it all together also. So we figured why not actually make a video explaining how it all happened. And now a couple of weeks ago, I put out a video called Why Am I Not an Air Traffic Controller? My specific interest in aviation is actually air traffic control. I was never interested in being a pilot or working on an airplane or at an airport. I just wanted to be an air traffic controller. And if you watch that video, I'll leave a link in the description below to that particular video. You'll learn exactly what happened and why I'm doing what I'm doing today. But something, of course, had to spark my interest, and it is all of a result of my dad actually really exposing me to aviation, even though he does not work in an industry in aviation at all. He has nothing to do with aviation in terms of his entire career, and he just really loves it. And that enthusiasm has spilled over to me over the years, of course. So that's really what's happened. And I'm going to start just going to get the camera over to you for a little bit to explain exactly why you got into it and how you got into it and your history with it.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, it really started in 1961, quite a few years ago, when I was the first one in my family probably to get on an airplane. It was at LaGuardia Airport. I was flying to Minneapolis, Minnesota. In those days, it was a Lockheed Electra, if I'm not mistaken. It was a 4-engine turboprop, and they had had some issues in the past. And to be quite frank with you, I was very frightened to get on that first plane to Minneapolis. I did it, and it worked out pretty well. From Minneapolis, I took some other small DC-3s to some other locations in the Dakotas, where I went to school for several years, believe it or not. And I started flying back and forth to New York through Minneapolis. At one point, Minneapolis then in New York actually changed to jet planes, and then we started flying jets.
And what airline was this on?
Northwest Orient at the time it was called, Northwest Orient, and then North Central Airlines, a now defunct airline, flying out of Minneapolis in the upper Midwest as well. To make this long story rather short, at this point, I came home from school, and then I went to, actually, I'm a physician, I went to medical school in Italy. So I started flying to Italy, and we did many crossings over the years. In the old days, when we were able to fly, we did a lot of charter flights. It was a big organization that chartered flights with students. And in those days, 707s and DC-8s. And in those days, again, the cockpit door was always kept open, and you were able to visit the cockpit. So it was quite fascinating as a young person to visit the cockpit somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, who knows where, and watch what was going on in that scenario, in that cockpit. And that really piqued my interest more and more about what goes on in the skies. Fast forward to many years later when Peter was born, and then in the, I guess, his early teenhood years. Since we live in New York City, I'm on one of the approach paths for LaGuardia Airport. I actually purchased a Bearcat scanner, and I was able to listen into the communication because I was always interested in what goes on up there, how they communicate to one another, how they communicate to the ground. Because that's really a hidden aspect of flying that the majority of even today's population doesn't understand and doesn't really understand what goes on up there. So I bought the scanner, started to listen in. Peter then became very obsessed with it at one point, started writing down all of the information he culled from the scanner itself, and actually led to the publishing of a book many years ago, which we self-published, and we did it several times. We republished it, sold through local sporting shops. No big deal, but it was a great exercise for him to learn how to write, compose, and edit, and then publish. That book still exists to this day. I think it was called Air Traffic Control at LaGuardia Airport.
New York City Air Traffic Control.
New York City Air Traffic Control. I even forgot it's that long.
It's been a while. 1994, I believe.
Yeah, something like that. And we actually at one point went to LaGuardia Airport with my old Nikon photograph camera. Took a photograph. I think it was a 727 taking off, if I'm not mistaken. It's on the cover of that. And that I give credit to myself.
You took the photo. Yeah, that was actually one of those rare runway 22 departure days, actually,
yeah,
where the aircraft was taking off on runway 22.
I remember that. And then in the subsequent years, we flew an awful lot to Europe. And I think I've done, maybe 75, 80 crossings already by air. So that piqued my interest, the beginning flights, which I was pretty damn nervous about, to be quite honest with you, going back to 1961. And by the way, those years, there was no such thing as TSA, no such thing as security. Your parents could practically walk you to the gate to get onto the plane. And it was a fascinating time. It was an interesting time as well. Times, as we know, have always changed and will change in the future as well. But flying is a real miracle, and we're not made to fly. And when we get inside an aluminum or a composite carbon fiber tube with wings and we soar off into the heavens, that's a miracle. And I think more people should understand more about the flight. And that's part of Peter's channel, actually, is to educate the flying public and perhaps the public that will fly about what goes on in the skies above. So that's my capsule summary of my story all these years. And we're still flying, thank God.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, it's a career path you didn't take. You actually already decided upon what your career was going to be. You were going to be a physician.
Yes.
And this kind of really occurred more in your later, I don't want to say too late, but in maybe your early 20s or so, when you were going to college, actually. When in college, you studied biology, which is kind of the path that you took to get to be a physician, ultimately before you went to medical school. And really what sparked your interest were these flights. Your first flight was from LaGuardia Airport.
LaGuardia Airport.
On Northwest Orient.
Northwest Orient Airlines.
Talk a little bit about your story. You mentioned Northwest Orient. I think you had mentioned to me once there was another airline that you took within the Dakotas also after connecting in Minneapolis, and how that actually worked out.
Yes, that other airline was a small regional airline called North Central Airlines, and they would fly DC-3s, the Goonie Bird, I think it's also called, which was a twin prop propeller-driven plane, obviously, with a tail dragger. And when you got on these planes, it was non-pressurized, obviously, no air conditioning, quite noisy. You could always smell the fumes of the gasoline in the engines. And I would say that when you flew, particularly in the summertime or the warmer climates, when you pass over the plowed ground, there's an awful lot of air turbulence, and I'm the first to admit it was more than once I got airsick on those planes. You think that would have turned me off on flying, but it didn't for some reason. So we persevered, did it, and that's our story, coming back now to the United States from Europe many times, and here we are again flying.
And when you went to medical school, you were going to Europe, you took what kind of aircraft type was that?
Well, they were always either 707s or I believe DC-8s as well. Interesting part of those aircraft that when you left Europe, Italy in particular, sometimes they would do the crossing, not stopping in Shannon Island, but going right to Gander, Newfoundland, and that's where we would do the refueling on the way to JFK. At the time, it was still called, I think, it was JFK at the time as well.
It was an Idlewild?
It was Idlewild in the old days.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was quite an experience when you had to refuel. Obviously today that's no longer the case, but those aircraft were tried and true. They did the job, and it was a fascinating experience. Sometimes we actually flew those planes out of Paris. We'd fly from Milano to Paris, and Paris using something called the Swiss Student Union. I'll never forget it. A charter plane coming out of Paris, again usually to Gatwick, and then all the way down to JFK.
Quite interesting. So you had these flights to the Dakotas, which were very, very, very frequent in your life. Then these flights across the pond, basically to Europe on a regular basis for, would you do 4 years of medical school in Italy?
Yes.
So 4 years
5
there.
years.
5 years, yeah. And then after that, did you do a lot of flying, or was there kind of like a lull in your travel?
No, we did a lot of flying after that as well, a lot of travel.
Between medical school, before I was born, did you do traveling?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been traveling all our lives, actually,
Yeah.
since I'm 18 years of age. So it's been a great experience to travel, obviously, and even a greater experience when you're sitting there and you're looking out the window and you know what you're looking at. You have references and you can see the ground below. There's so much to learn from flying high looking down.
Absolutely, 100%. That's the whole joy of flight. It's not, the seat back pitch, how far the tray table goes down. It's the view out the window, 100%. So a lot of this enthusiasm that he developed really transpired over to me. And my first flight was in, what would you say, 1983, 84 or so?
I don't remember the exact year, but we were going to Disney World, I think it was, Disneyland in Los Angeles.
In California, right.
And his first flight was on a 747, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it was actually...
and I got to admit, he did get sick on the plane.
I did get sick my very, very first flight. We won't talk about that. But my very first flight was on an American Airlines 747, probably a 100, 200 series. It was either flight 1 or flight 4. I don't recall the exact flight number. And that was my very first flight back in the early 1980s. I was just a few years old at that particular time. And subsequently, we just did occasional trips, really more towards in the United States during the winter. But then we started going to Italy regularly. So every single summertime, we would board, as a family, an Alitalia 747-200 from JFK to either Rome or Milan and visit your medical school in Italy and go back and forth. So my first early memories are really on these 747s going back and forth to and from Italy. And subsequently, after that, we did more domestic flights. And it wasn't until I was really in my 20s or 30s that I started flying very, very frequently. Apologize for all the noise in the background. We're actually at an airport right now. If you haven't guessed, we're at the Palm Beach International Airport here in Florida, and he's actually getting ready to take a flight up to LaGuardia, of course, on Delta.
Back to LaGuardia.
I will be doing the same thing. My schedule doesn't permit. My flight's about 2 days later, so of course we will be filming videos of that.
I want to add one thing, that prior to 9/11 on Alitalia, if you would ask the flight attendants if the young person could visit the cabin, they were very gracious, and usually midpoint they'd come to your plane, come to your seat, and Peter flew in the jump seat many times, landing in Rome Fiumicino, and did it reverse as well, landing in Kennedy. We have a couple of
True
pictures.
story.
We have a couple of pictures at home. I'm actually sitting in the cockpit of a 747.
It happened. I sat right behind the pilot coming into JFK Airport, out of all airports.
So he'd leave us mid-flight. I wouldn't see him until the plane landed again, and we'd pick him up near the cockpit and deplane. Those were the good old days when we lived our life without fear. So we were lucky to have that experience.
All right, well, he's got a flight to catch. He's going up to LaGuardia. I'm taking the flight up to LaGuardia about 2 days after today. Our schedules just didn't match. So you're flying on what today?
A 737-800. It's an older aircraft, 23 years, and I hope it's refurbished interior.
Yeah, some of those 737-800s are a little bit old on the inside, but I understand that Delta is making an effort to make them look a little bit more modern. All right, well, thank you so much for being here today. Definitely the audience has been asking these questions about you. Who are you? What's your history? How did this all come to be? So there you have it.
Now the secret is out.
Exactly. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll be back again, of course, with many more videos where I'm doing the flying or he's doing the flying. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit the bell button, and see you very, very soon.
Bye-bye.